Welcome to OhSister, where I unpack my Mormon sister missionary journals 10 years later. So this is actually my second time recording this introductory segment. The first time through, I had this whole list of church talks and media that I read through with the idea of giving a semi-comprehensive overview of how the LDS Church has consistently pushed body-shaming diet culture rhetoric since at least the 80s. Except it turned out that ended up being an hour long, and while it was eye-opening to see just how much of this stuff we had been fed over the decades, and it was from like church resources, it was honestly just pretty depressing, and it still felt like I was kind of adding to the problem because I wasn't giving an explanation of where the problem came from or what the solution is, right? So I'm still going to link those things in the description that you can go and read these examples of how the church was teaching things that are like kind of diet culture, eating disorder, body shaming, etc. You can read that if you want to. But yeah, so I decided I wanted to really focus more on educating where this kind of messaging actually came from in the first place and why it's such a problem. So before I read about what the church has been teaching us about our relationships with food and our bodies, let's start by learning from the American Psychiatry Association's website and get a basic definition of eating disorders. Okay, so here is just a little part from their article under eating disorders, weight shaming, and clean eating. Okay, so it says, I quote, "Eating disorders affect all kinds of people, women, men," I'll add non-binary because they didn't add that, young and old, and from all racial and ethnic backgrounds. Many factors likely contribute to developing eating disorders, including a range of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. High levels of body image dissatisfaction and setting unrealistically high expectations for oneself, or perfectionism, also increase the risk. Experiencing teasing or bullying about weight or weight stigma, like discrimination or stereotyping based on weight, also increase a person's risk for eating disorders. And then it says the best known environmental contributor to developing an eating disorder is the cultural idealization of thinness. Okay, so this is basically the focus of what I'm talking about today. I like this resource because, yes, although the historical background on like the being afraid of gaining weight or being afraid of like fat, feeling like it's unhealthy, and you know all the things that I'm going to talk about, although it's based on racist stuff, so it's based on discriminating against Black people, particularly Black women, that doesn't mean that it doesn't affect everyone, you know, so we are all kind of being hurt by this perpetuation of problematic things that we've inherited from our forerunners, right? And the, you know, experiencing teasing or bullying about weight or weight stigma increases a person's risk for eating disorders. That certainly is how a lot of the church stuff I was reading came across. You know, it felt very shaming or other, you know, about weight and bodies and laziness and, you know, all that stuff. And of course there's the mention of perfectionism, which was really big for me on my mission, but it's, I think, pretty typical for the Mormon experience. And then, of course, the best, they say the best and known environmental contributor for developing an eating disorder is the cultural idealization of thinness. So I want to jump from there and give you this very awesome, the history is not awesome, but knowing it is awesome, because by knowing where things came from and how they're actually not true, right? That's how we can change things, let's change the lies that we believe that we were taught growing up, right? Let's change that. And that's how we change the world, right? So I think that's awesome. So we're going to do that awesome work by learning the depressing history of how we inherited fat phobia from previous generations. And spoiler alert, it's just racism and misogyny. Once again, I'm not trying to push an agenda. This is simply what the medical people are saying, right? The researchers, the sociologists, okay? So, in 2019, author Sabrina Strings published the book titled Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. And it's on my list of books to read. I haven't read it yet, but I found a really awesome review of the book that was on a university's website, UCLA. So there's a student who read the book and they put together a really good summary of the important topic points of the book. So I'm going to still read the book when I get my hands on it, but this I thought was a good way to give you the basic material so that we can all have our historical information be more accurately living in our brains together, right? Okay, so let me start reading that. So, this is all direct quotes unless I say otherwise. In her award-winning book, Fearing the Black Body, sociologist Sabrina Strings tells us the story of how our world has come to be dominated by fat phobia, or fear of fatness, and the deeply anti-Black roots this fear entails. Okay, so now I'm going to summarize for a minute here. So, according to Strings' research, which has been, corroborated, right? When we look back at, focusing on, sort of Western European American history, right? If we look back before the slave trade, the ideals for what was seen as admirable and beautiful were really different, okay? So before, if we look at the High Renaissance specifically, and this is the period just before the slave trade really shaped everything socially to be super different from how it had been for most of human history. If we look at that society and culture, there is this general consensus in culture that women who had more weight, who had larger bodies, they were admired as beautiful and aspirational. And thin women were seen as lowly and inferior. And in fact, if they were trying to make someone, in paintings or art, if they were trying to show through the art that this person was, important and aspirational and beautiful, whatever, they would paint them with a bigger body, right? And with, cellulite and all that. Versus if it was someone who was, not trustworthy or inferior or sickly, not saying that these are, this is just how it was, they would be painted as a thin person. And from the various resources that I've read on this topic, this seems to be a general consensus of the majority of worldwide human cultures until they are impacted by the slave trade. So In the Americas and in like European countries that were connected and benefiting from all this slavery and colonization, by the late 1700s is where we start to see this shift in perception of what is beautiful and good and aspirational. Okay, so I'm quoting again. Soon, a thin physique had gone from being a sign of sickliness to evidence of the moral and intellectual superiority of Europeans, supported by the writings of anthropologists and naturalists seeking to, this is important, codify and biologize a racial hierarchy. These works placed particular emphasis on the bodies of Southern African women who were depicted as grotesquely monstrous and animalistic. Okay, so to explain this again, once the slave trade was making a really big impact in, like, for example, the Americas and in Europe, in order to make people feel okay about the dehumanization and depravity and harm and injustices of an entire population of people, it was the work of anthropologists and naturalists and scientists and all these people. They made ideas to prove that, like, quote unquote white people were better than, like, quote unquote black people, right? So they made up all these things, and the particular like point of, like, here's our example, is they would use the example of black women as saying, like, look, these women are, like, seen as lesser, right? Less human. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that's what they were saying, okay? So I'm going to continue reading. As the 19th century, so this is the 1800s, as the 19th century gave rise to the American Empire, so came the medicalized derision of the figure of the robust black African woman. In an effort to define the ideal of American beauty, and thereby to sustain white supremacy over immigrants and enslaved Africans, thinness grew as an index of both racial and class distinction. And then, by the early 20th century, the culturally, scientifically, and religiously embedded derision of fat as a sign of racial otherness, intellectual inferiority, and moral debasement set the stage for a century that culminated in the newest moral panic around fat. The so-called obesity epidemic, which problematizes black women in particular as social dead weight, relies on deeply political knowledge about bodies cloaked in rhetoric of objective science. Okay, so that felt a little bit, that was a little bit dense. So let me just sort of restate that for our brains, right? So the slave trade was happening, making America and Europe, giving countries a lot of money because they were, profiting off of, inhumane enslaved people's labor, right? And they had to uphold this, so they made the like biological, racist medical stuff. And specifically, it was like, okay, we don't like black women. We do not want them to be seen as worthwhile or feminine or, like worth rights at all, basically, they really wanted to delineate between black women and white women and just kind of separate, like, quote unquote real white Americans from anyone who didn't fit that, who was like an immigrant or enslaved, etc. So being thin was used as one of the ways to show this distinction of, like, whether you are worthy of being treated well and seen as like human and being worth taking care of. And this all snowballs into this like big cultural thing of just, you know, the way people talk to each other and what we write about and what we make art about and movies, you know, all of that, plus all the scientific stuff that people were writing and doing in order to show, like, yeah, we're not terrible for enslaving people and being horribly violent and cruel to them. No, this is based on science, right? And then the other aspect is the religion. So there's culture, science, and religion are all in this swarm of upholding the racial hierarchy from the slave trade. And it results in the, like, this moral panic around fatness. Okay. So that's kind of where it comes from, right? So it's a lot. I recommend continuing to read about this. You could start with the links I've put in the description. But I'm going to read one more paragraph from this, and then we'll go to the final, resource on this topic, okay? So, this last paragraph here is as follows. Without understanding how fat phobia emerged in response to slavery, and in order to solidify whiteness as an embodied phenomenon, or in other words, to make whiteness be like an actual thing and not just like, oh, well, we're all from these different cultures. Like, no, specifically, all these people from all these cultures are white, and anyone with, you know, more melanin or enslaved, whatever, they're black, right? To make that happen, we cannot grasp how our contemporary obsession with thinness is rooted in anti-blackness. Okay, so we have to have this whole, all of this background information in order to realize that the fear that has been instilled in you and I since basically birth to be so afraid of not being thin, it's rooted in anti-blackness, okay? I'll keep reading. The most current manifestation of institutionalized fat phobia around, and this is in quote marks in the paper, obesity as a public health crisis is deeply reliant on the same ideologies that European race scientists drew on to construct fat as indicative of the laziness of body, mind, and spirit. Okay, so that's the final thing from this. That's basically right now there's this I mean, it's not just now, it's been a while, but there's this so-called public health crisis of obesity, and there's so much moral health panic about this. And it's framed as a problem of laziness of body, mind, and spirit. And this is something I saw a lot when I was reading through all the church resources of overcoming the natural man, laziness of body, laziness of mind, laziness of spirit, right? And this is all, that's where that comes from. It's from all of this stuff. And yeah, the overall social fear that we all carry and perpetuate as we carry, the fear of larger bodies, the fear of what we have called obesity, it's just based on the same ideas that crazy scientists and doctors in the 1800s were making up about head sizes and all the weird debunked stuff that we all know is not true and is just terrible racist stuff. It's this is that too, it turns out. So I wanted to give you a concise explanation of how racism, weight stigma, and biased medical information are tied together. So instead of me just saying things that I've heard, I wanted to give you a reputable medical source. So now we're jumping to the University of Chicago's public health outreach website. Okay, so this was written by, I think, a registered dietitian. I don't know what RD and LDN mean, but since it's from a university's public health website, I trust it pretty well, and I was looking at some of the things that were cited, and they were all like, like the the International Journal of Obesity, and like sources that both seemed like pretty big and trustworthy and also relevant, So it doesn't seem like it's just like offshoot ideas. It seems like this is pretty mainstream medical information. Okay, so so just reminding us where we are so far. So far, we understand that the whole culture of diet culture and eating disorders and weight shaming, right? This affects all of us. No matter who you are or where you live or how old you are, whatever, it's just become so universal. And we learned where the history of this is from racism and like misogyny of trying to make sure that Black women are the lowest in the hierarchy and solidify that it's okay to hate them. It's really not, but that's like the point, right? Okay, so now we go to the medical information, and this is current medical information. So she's written this helpful public health outreach document, and there are 3 sections. Okay, so the first section says the problems with weight-based approaches to health. There are other things here as well, but I'm going to read just the first one. So in this section, we learn, for example, that a study from the International Journal of Obesity found that of the 40,000 U.S. adults included in the study, roughly half of the individuals who were categorized as overweight were actually metabolically healthy, while more than a third of those listed as at a healthy weight were actually metabolically unhealthy. So the takeaway is, quote, if extrapolated to the U.S. population, an estimated 75 million U.S. adults are misclassified as unhealthy or healthy if based on the BMI, body mass index, alone. And, this is going to blow your mind, those in the overweight BMI category actually have the greatest longevity out of any BMI group. Let that sink in. Okay, so basically, if we focus on just weight alone as an indicator of health, it's actually really likely to be inaccurate whether or not the BMI index says that you are overweight or at a like normal healthy weight, right? They also should talk about how the BMI index is actually not that useful either, but I'm not going to read that. You can read it if you want to. So yeah, here's the overall conclusion, right? When the medical system uses BMI as a health indicator, it can lead to misdiagnosis for people in larger bodies, with the risk of real medical concerns being overlooked as the focus is placed on weight or weight loss. Similarly, people in thinner bodies are often underdiagnosed due to an assumption of good health. Okay? So basically, in our current social fabric, even going to the doctor is not it's not like safe from this old and somewhat undying monster of racism and fatphobia that came from racism, because like it turns out no matter what size your body, this overemphasis on like whether or not you're overweight is making it less likely for you to actually be treated for what you need treatment for or diagnosed with what you need, It's like, it's just focusing on the wrong thing. Okay. Interesting, right? So let's go to the second section. The risks of food restriction and eating disorders. So in this section, we learn that the rates of eating disorders and disordered eating are increasing, and they're becoming normalized. We learn that food restriction is harmful, and we learn that weight cycling is bad for our health. And to discuss weight cycling a little bit more, and this repeated loss and regain of weight is associated with all-cause mortality from cardiovascular disease, risk for heart attack, stroke, diabetes, high blood pressure, and suppressed immune function. And that was really eye-opening for me, because what I was taught all growing up from school and doctors and everything is that those are all the risks of having a larger body, when in fact, research is showing that those risks of cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, high blood pressure, suppressed immune function, those can be the result of the patterns we are told to use to decrease our weight, right? So repeated loss and regain of weight, which is kind of, yeah, okay, well, I won't talk about that, but okay. Yes, the final section. I'm just going to go to the final section, okay? In the discussion on overall health outcomes, they summarize that while research does show a link between high BMI, or like body mass index, or quote overweight, so research shows a link between high BMI and worse health outcomes, we actually need to look at different factors to understand someone's health and what they need. So it's not likely that if someone is having health issues that it's because of their weight. It's likely that it's because of the negative effects that come from weight cycling, or basically constantly having to go on diets all the time because our doctors and our societies tells us to, right? That's what is dangerous and unhealthy. It's also likely that they've shown that the overarching social pressure and stress that comes from the weight stigma of living in a larger body can cause negative health outcomes. And then there are also long-term effects of trauma. So that's really what we need to be having our doctors help us with, and that's really what our doctors should be looking at, and what we individually can sort of focus on to help our own mortality be longer. Right? It's basically it's more dangerous to experience weight cycling from the diets that we're told to go on than it is to just live in a larger body, right? So, okay, all that's very heavy, I know. And it's probably, I know it's possible that this is the first time you're hearing any of this, so you might be feeling really skeptical or really defensive or really angry or frustrated. So that's okay. I recommend giving yourself a gentleness break if that helps. But But if you're having a really strong reaction to this, either like, no, that must not be true, or like, oh no, that's true and like my whole life is messed up. It's okay. It's gonna be okay. It's all gonna be okay. You can put a hand on your heart and just say it's gonna be okay. And take a deep breath, right? And one good thing about this website is because it's a public health outreach website, they actually have some good actionable do's and don'ts that we can all start to incorporate in our own lives, in our own circle of influence, right? And that's good because that's what is needed. And of course, as a little foreshadow, guess which of these the LDS Church has historically done? You know, the one true church led by God, who never does anything wrong, and they always have the most morally correct information. It's not really any of them. So here are 3 of the suggestions that they have. 1, appreciate that bodies come in all different shapes and sizes, and that fat people can be just as healthy as thin people. Remember, you cannot tell someone's health on the inside by looking at their size. Okay, so that feels pretty like a pretty different perspective from what I was told all growing up. Let's look at number 2. Don't moralize foods. For example, you need to stop eating X. Instead, promote eating for pleasure, hunger, satiety, and nutrition instead of weight. Okay, so that one feels very, very relevant to not only my own personal experience as a Mormon woman, but also the stuff I was reading about, like the church's recommendations for its members and kind of their moralizing and shaming. A lot of it was about the food you eat or don't eat. And of course, on my mission, there was so much focus on like, don't eat, like I shouldn't eat this, or I should eat less of this, right? So yeah, instead of moralizing foods, what we would like to learn to do, right, is promote eating for pleasure, hunger, satiety, and nutrition, instead of focusing on weight. Okay. And then the 3rd tip they have is promote mindful movement focused on what brings people joy and connection, not weight loss. Okay. So that was a lot of information. I would like to finish this section by looking at one of the resources I had originally used here. So this is one of the church resources, and this is someone's personal story that was published in 2016 in the Ensign magazine, which is a magazine the church sends out, I think, every month. And it's like just more good church material for the people. And the magazine, the title is Physical Health, Weight Loss, and the Word of Wisdom. So in sharing this specific message, I'm not intending to shame the woman who wrote and submitted this story. My intention is to show how the church emphasizes diet culture, body shaming, and fat-phobic ideas as part of their approved message of what is godly and good. So I don't think it's this individual woman's fault for having this experience, and I also fully believe that she has the right to do whatever she likes with her body as long as she's not hurting other people. I think what's problematic about this is the fact that the church highlighted the story and the way that it's written, because it basically reads like an ad for a weight loss drug or a new diet or something. That's what it really reminded me of when I read it. And the focus is on these ideas that, as we've just learned, are actually not healthy and not helpful. Okay, so to summarize the message, this woman shares that she noticed when she was in her 60s that she was starting to feel like less overall well. She was struggling with low energy and stamina, and she also shared her weight. I'm not gonna put the numbers though, because I know that can be like triggering for people, but she decided she wanted to improve her health, and because she lives in the world that we all live in, with the information she had, she decided that the best way to do that was to lose weight. So she decided she was going to lose weight, and she turned to the LDS scriptures and she read the word of wisdom, and that became her motivating promise of better health. And she was like, okay, this is going to be my lifestyle. And she got to work with the standard diet culture practices. So she writes about doing things like tracking calories and getting hyper-focused on researching nutritional information on food and quitting sugar. And then over the space of a few years, she met her weight goals and shares that she felt overall much healthier. So before I go on, I just want to remind us all that although I'm not going to vilify any of these strategies that she was using, we did just learn that focusing on losing weight and restricting food and hyperfixating on the healthiness of food can actually be really unhelpful long-term strategies. Okay. So now I'll go to how the article finishes, because I think this really illuminates the heart of the matter, and she said it really well, so it's a direct quote. She said, "Controlling the things I eat is part of overcoming the natural man. See Mosiah 3:19. In turn, it tweaks my spiritual discernment, allowing me to receive the promises that I shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures." D&C 89:19. Giving up fast food for wisdom is a good trade-off. I am most grateful to a loving Heavenly Father who heard my simple plea and gave me insight into the word of wisdom. I know the word of wisdom is revelation. I know it can change lives. End quote. Okay, so on my mission, I was getting really focused on the if-then, obedience, promise, blessings aspect of the church doctrine, as well as the idea that church doctrine applies to literally every aspect of life. And I can see from this takeaway that that was how this woman looked at it as well, and that is the message that the church was promoting in publishing this and spreading it with the official seal of approval, right? This is from church resources. And we see the if-then promise blessing, right, of if you follow the word of wisdom and do all of these diet culture strategies, then the promise is you'll lose weight, you'll feel better, you'll overcome the natural man, you'll have a greater spiritual discernment, right? And if you remember, one of the original basis of this fat phobia happening in our society was the idea that having a larger body is a result of laziness of body, mind, and spirit. And here in this woman's story and in the scriptures, we see once again this correlation of she basically is saying, once I became healthier and lost weight, then my body, mind, and spirit are freed. I've lost the laziness. I've lost the natural man taking over me, right? It's like surprisingly the same message, but except for not surprisingly at all, because that's kind of where it came from, right? And of course, there's also just this idea that if someone in the church is feeling like they're struggling with their health or wellness or something, that the best resource for how to improve your life is to go to the church resources, right? Like now, I see that as kind of confusing and strange, but on my mission and when I was a super believing Mormon, that was standard protocol. You know, if I was like, had any problem, the first resource I would turn to would be church resources. And that's why originally when I was recording this episode, I wanted to share all of these stories and things that the church has been putting out over the years to show that there is no lack of examples of the church telling us, particularly women, but you know, this affects all of us, whether or not we're women, telling us that we should not be overweight. It's bad to gain weight. It's like unhealthy and unbeautiful and ungodly. And we should do everything we can. Like we should restrict our food and we should restrict the sugar we're eating, etc. It's like all from church resources. And it turns out that this practice of turning to the church for advice on every problem in my life, in this way, it was actively harming me. If I had been like, I'm having a lot of pressure about the food I'm eating and like I'm feeling really worried about gaining weight, if I had turned to someone whose job it was to help with this, hopefully they would have given me better information. Although, you know, who knows, right? Because this is still such a problem in all of society anyway, but I guess it's just a little bit, it was part of my deconstruction to realize that I believed that the church was perfect even if the people weren't, and that the church had all the best information and the church was ahead of the grain, ahead of all the rest of the world. And the more I learned about things like this, that like actually the church was promoting stuff that was actively harming people who listened to it, that's the more that I realized, like, oh, this doesn't really feel like a good group to be a part of. It certainly doesn't feel like it's led by a loving God or omniscient. So that's my spiel. I'll probably have to keep talking about this, but I didn't want to talk about it anymore without laying sort of the foundation of these ideas, because it's so triggering for so many people to listen to and talk about. So I wanted to make sure that I had all of this laid out at least a little bit for us to be aware of. So hopefully that was an okay listen for you, and hopefully you learned some things, because I learned some things too. It's been really good for me to keep working on this project, but it turns out it takes a lot of time every week to keep this up. If you have the desire and the means to support me financially, it really makes a difference. Of course, I do have the disclaimer that your donations will not bring eternal salvation for you or anyone else. But if you're still interested, there are links in the description where you can make a one-time donation or sign up to be a monthly patron to support this and my other creative work. Okay, let's get back to it. Monday, February 23rd, 2015. Mission Day 136. The highlight of the day was definitely our lesson with the swans. No, they're not less active, but they really needed someone to tell them they're doing a great job. A good job. Sister Swan has been so stressed about parenting and what others think and all that. So we came over and shared the principles from the family, A Proclamation to the World, all of which they are doing. And then they lifted us up too. They started to cry a little and said, "We've done so much for this ward. Brother Swan wants so badly for us to stay on the path. He gave us a talk to help us to remember to constantly ask not, 'Who can help me?' but 'Who can I help?' Quote, 'Don't let yourself quit. We don't want to lose you,' unquote." I promised I wouldn't, and so did Sister Johnson. They said, "We'll need to stay in contact." I'm so grateful for this transfer. I'm so grateful for at least 5 more weeks in Scranton. I love these people so much. Wow. Kind of a sweet little moment despite the way things have played out, It was honestly nice to read that we went and spent time with a family that was, they were active and they were supposedly the kind of people we weren't supposed to be spending our time with because they didn't need help. But I don't know, I guess I appreciate that Sister Johnson and I were like, the Swans are doing a lot and they seem kind of down and we're going to spend some time telling them how awesome they are. Of course, the way that I did that on my mission was by reading them about the stuff about the family proclamation, and even if you're using that as a completely healthy reference for how to live life, it's likely that they would have felt like they didn't actually measure up to everything. So it's hopefully this didn't just feel a little bit shame-inducing for them, little deep inside parts of them that are like, "Oh, but I'm not actually doing all this stuff." Hopefully it was hopefully it felt good. But it makes sense. That's what my missionary brain would think. It stood out to me that I wrote down that Sister Swan was stressed about parenting and what others think and all that, because I knew that's just a pretty standard part of really just being human, but especially it's a standard part of the LDS parent experience, and even perhaps especially for being a mother, because there's just so much doctrine and social and cultural pressure about how important it is and what it means, and stressful time. So yeah, also I thought it was sweet that they really liked us as missionaries, and they said that we'd been doing really a lot for the ward. I don't totally remember this experience, but reading through this, I can sort of remember what that would have felt like, right? That would have felt super validating, and I would have said that I felt like the Spirit, and I would have said I felt like God's love, and then, of course, there's this strange, I see it as a dichotomy now, but at that point, I didn't see it as a dichotomy of that they really loved us. They really wanted us to stay happy and well, and basically stay as on the path to happiness and salvation as we were on our missions. That was a really common human feeling. Not everybody connects it to, oh, I love you and I want you to stay in my religion. I think it's often just like, oh, I love you and you're so precious and important and you have so much to offer the world, right? But in the Mormon context, it's often like, if you care about someone, it's like, oh, well, I want them to be happy. I want them to have eternal life. And I want them to like stay being this positive force for good. So I want them to not be lost. And then the dichotomy part is like, in order to do that, you have to stay selfless, you know? Like he said, always be asking, who can I help? Always be looking out, reaching out, trying to help other people. And that is seen as the way to ensure your eternal salvation, aka your happiness and like value and the worth that you provide to the rest of the world, right? And now that's just totally the opposite view of what I have. Like, even though I think it's really important to reach out and see who you can help, I think it's just as important to be able to say who can help me and like, what do I need? What do I want? I think I think that's very important, you know? I guess I say every week, you love others best when you love yourself first. And that's really been my experience. And that's what all the therapists say. So I feel like there's something to it, but let's just keep going. Okay. Tuesday, February 24th, 2015, Mission Day 137. Lynn had us come over this afternoon to help clean Josephine's home while she's away for the funeral. I had fun cleaning up the bathroom while Sister Johnson and Lynn did the kitchen, and Sister Swan did Colleen's room. Apparently, the lavender-scented Mr. Clean solution is pretty awesome. I used it on everything, and it smelled super fresh. Since we weren't able to console Brenda yesterday when Roger went over, we came over today and shared a message and our spaghetti squash dinner. This time, Brenda got the leftovers. We did super well today. No cookies, no sweets. No sugar day success. Okay. I guess let's go backwards. So, I already talked about the whole the troubles with food restriction, sugar restriction, the obsession with not wanting to, gain weight or be quote unquote unhealthy. So I'll just point out that there's just one more day of me thinking about it so much that it makes it into my journal. And before that, I don't exactly remember the situation with Brenda and Roger, but maybe he was like an ex or like a previous coworker. So I don't know, someone who she didn't like to interact with and was really stressful. So I guess he had visited the day before for some reason, and we knew. So this time we went and we brought her some dinner and tried to help her feel better. So that's I'm glad we could do that. I guess I wish that Brenda could have had a little bit more support in general, because looking back, I could see how much she was reliant on the missionaries for having people who cared about her and talk to her regularly, and it was really great and fun when I was there. I had a great time getting to know her, but the perception of time when you're a missionary gets really wonky. So I didn't really realize that for Brenda, it could be something like every few months, like the people that she interacts with the most, they like switch out for someone else. So she has to like become friends with someone, and it's like if that happened to me in my life, like I'm trying to make friends with someone and then they're like, oh, in 3 months I'm gonna be gone, like, whoa. That really sucks. So that's kind of sticking out to me as a way where ideally the church had a little bit more stability of social connection for her. And maybe she is also friends with like the people who lived in the area, but it seems like we were the ones who were closest with her when like really big stuff went down. So I don't know. And I guess kind of similar to this point, the big thing I noticed when I was reading through cleaning Josephine's house was I think that was a really important service to provide, right? This kind of thing can be really life-saving and really important for a lot of people and their experience in the church. But I just noticed that it was only women who did this cleaning. I'm just noticing. So it was also all recruited by Lynn. So she knew us, the sister missionaries, really well. And then we knew Sister Swan really well because she was really involved with us because she really liked doing missionary work. So Josephine, big tragedy at a funeral, hasn't been able to take care of her home with her little kids because of, all this stuff going on. And there was the element of she wasn't an active member, so it wasn't like coordinated by the Relief Society. It was just like coordinated by her mom. So I'm like, oh, that's like too bad that it wasn't coordinated by the church. But it happened and it needed to be done. And it did happen, right? But also pretty lame that in this story, in this memory and other things that I can remember, it's like very gendered the way that service is done. If someone needs to move, it's usually the men, and then sometimes the sister missionaries would go help too. But, it was very gendered, like, oh, we have to lift up things. It's going to be a big group of guys. We have to spend an entire day cleaning someone's house. It's going to be the women. Yes. All right, let's just keep going. Wednesday, February 25th, 2015, Mission Day 138. Meet the Mormons showed for award Wednesday activity. Esther was the only investigator to make it, but it was still awesome. Surprisingly, it was not I, but Sister Johnson who cried throughout. That movie makes me so glad I'm a missionary with time to learn. Knowing that I haven't even hit the midpoint of my time here is so comforting. Also, we had a lesson with Daniel on the first part of the gospel right after, and it was super good too. Yay! Okay, that's on Wednesday. I guess I had this sort of thing with Sister Johnson where we both tried to be stoic, but I would cry more often than her out of like stress or whatever. And if I think I've talked about Meet the Mormons before, but just reminding you, it's this little like 1 hour sort of promotional film that the church made, and it's got different people's stories, different member stories throughout the world, and they kind of show like, look, here's our really wholesome Christian family living. Don't you want to join? And there's lots of like kind of tear-jerking, wholesome moments. And one of the things is a missionary. In my head, it's David Archuleta, but I don't think it's actually about David Archuleta going on a mission. I don't think that's... He was a missionary at the time, but I don't think this film was about him. Anyway, it shows the story of some young man getting ready for his mission and then, like hugging his mom goodbye. And I think that's like kind of what got Sister Johnson crying. Anyway, it was really interesting to read through this because I was reading, I'm writing about how Sister Johnson cried watching this movie and like, oh yeah, there's like missionaries leaving their parents and like, maybe I'm going to talk about that. And then the thing that I say after is so not in line with what I was expecting. I thought I was going to write, oh, that movie like hits so hard because it's like I really am away from my family and like it really is like a big sacrifice and it's like so like powerful or whatever. But no, that's not what I wrote. I wrote about how I'm so glad that I still have more time on my mission because I feel so behind and I need to work so hard and I need to learn so much and I constantly feel like I'm not good enough. And so I'm like glad that I'm just at the beginning because I don't want to like feel like this my whole mission, I'm like, oh good, there's still time for me to like get better and like figure this out and be a good missionary. Yeah, I remember I was like so jealous of the elders for getting to have the entire 2 years, 24 months. And the sisters were only allowed to be there for a year and a half. I was very jealous of that because I was like, by the time I'm hitting my stride, it's like I'm going home, That was one reason I really wanted to serve English speaking. I didn't want to waste half my mission learning a language. And it's funny to look back on that now because I'm like, well, actually, the whole thing kind of feels like a waste. But if I had learned a language, then it would have at least been... I would have spent that time learning a language. Oh, well. Let's keep going. Thursday, February 26th, 2015. Mission Day 139. Sometimes a day just feels slow for no apparent reason. An analogy we found was how today looked beautiful outside, but every time we were in the car, it remained a constant dull -1 degrees Fahrenheit. Just unexpectedly even and tiring. But still peaceful, thankfully. We had an interesting experience this evening. We just pulled up to the curb by Brother Congar's apartment when we saw an interesting scenario play out. 2 young teens helping a staggering middle-aged man up to their black jacked-up stoner truck with lewd decals. It felt very sketchy. So we listened to the spirit and waited them out in the car. After we said our before-lesson prayer, we looked up and they were walking back in. Sister Johnson looked over at me and said, "I'm pretty sure we just witnessed a drug deal." I answered the affirmative, "Yup." Then we climbed out of the car and went on with our proselyting. There's a first for everything, I suppose. And then I linked a scripture, but I'm not going to go look it up. My goodness. Okay. Family home evening with Jessica was pretty fun. The Swans had to bail last minute when Candace, Sister Swan, got sick. So we pulled a Jason lesson and had the children act out, "Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead." It was crazy again, but the kids learned that Jesus is real and faith is important, so the end goal was met. Also, Kylie wanted to say the opening prayer. We took Brother Hennon to the Pizza Hut buffet for lunch, which resulted in eating sugar. Repentance. Smiley face. Okay, So, first of all, referring to the teens with the middle-aged man and supposed drug deal. I guess it's possible it was a drug deal or it was something fishy. But I definitely had this extra element of like anything that wasn't super conforming to being very straight-laced and clean-cut. I was immediately like, this is evil and bad. If you remember when I was like, oh, I'm meeting with this less active man, and if he would just, God loves him even though he has a ponytail. Like, my goodness. So yeah, if I see something that I would describe on my mission as a black jacked up stoner truck with lewd decals, like clearly I'm not going to trust these people no matter what's going on. It is also possible that it was a drug deal, and I don't know. That seemed notable to me, though. Also, I thought it was funny that my goal for doing a family home evening lesson with Jessica and her family was to get the kids to believe that Jesus is real, because we were struggling with that with Jessica's daughter. She just she wouldn't believe us that Jesus was a real person with a body. She was like, no, he's an angel. And I guess maybe she was believing us now, or at least the kids in general were like, okay, sure, Jesus. I don't know. Yeah, I guess we know my thoughts on that lesson. And then the last thing, of course, is this is the most egregious, like, morality around healthy in quotes, restrictive food eating. Like, I literally wrote that we ate sugar and I needed to repent for eating sugar. Now, if you're not clear, you are only supposed to repent for something that's like a sin. And this is certainly not like typical LDS cause for repentance, I would think, but like normally it's not seen as an actual sin to eat sugar. Maybe it's like, well, maybe you just shouldn't. I don't know, but like saying that I'm gonna repent is pretty extreme. But it was very in line with mission culture stuff and like be obedient, and my mission president has told us we need to eat super healthy and we should like try to not eat sugar, and I need to obey that, and I need to take care of myself, which I thought meant super controlling about what I was eating. I already talked about that, but my goodness. Sister Finlayson, you don't have to repent for eating sugar, okay? That's what I want to say about that. Okay. Friday, February 27th, 2015, Mission Day 140. We had an awesome lesson with Marcus Abel this evening. He wasn't drinking. He was intently listening, often looking us in the eye. He felt the spirit and recognized it. He's going to read the Book of Mormon and pray. I can see it. He wants to know, how great is his potential? I'm so glad we tracked it into his door. We almost didn't. His was just a spur of the moment, just one more occasion. And that's all I wrote. Okay, so we probably were late or something, rushing, so I'll say two things about this. I was really like, oh, he's not drinking, he's like confident, he's looking us in the eye, he's listening, aka Ergo, he feels the Spirit. He recognizes that it's God speaking to him, that everything we're saying is true. And because he feels that, he's going to believe and do all of this. He's going to be totally committed. And that's what I was taught to think. So it makes sense that I thought that. Now, I would say he probably felt a little bit less nervous after having already met with us, so he didn't feel like he needed to drink, maybe. And he had us over because he cared, so it makes sense that he was, like, paying attention. I guess we'll see how that pans out in the future, right? We'll see if he ends up committing to baptism. And then the second thing I wanted to say was, I wrote in kind of the sneaky way that I would write about it on my mission of, like, trying to prove that everything was, like, guided by God and guided by the Spirit, because I wrote, like, I mean, we almost didn't track into his door. It was just, like, it was just kind of last minute, like, oh, just one more. And thinking that meant that the Spirit told us we were going to leave, we were going to be done tracting, and then in that moment, there's this moment of hesitation and inspiration, revelation, where God is like, hey, this kid is ready. Gotta knock on his door. So that's how I interpreted that, and that's why I wrote it down that way. But after my mission, actually, while I was still actively believing Mormon, and I was at school, I started going to the counseling center at BYU because I had been diagnosed with anxiety, and I was realizing that this kind of backwards thinking of, like, oh, I did this compulsive thing. I was going around doing my thing, decided not to do, but then I had this compulsion to try just one more, and I'm like, oh, well, I can't, oh, that feeling's from God, so I'm gonna go do it anyway, right? It turns out that was like an anxiety, that was like disordered, that was like that was an anxiety disorder, at least according to the BYU counseling people. So, they were totally in line with the church. They're not trying to keep anyone out of the church. If anything, they're trying to help them, stay healthy and active, right? But while I was like the Relief Society president at the time, when I was realizing, like, oh, sometimes when I think I'm being guided by God, it's actually I'm just being, like, anxious and, like, compulsive about something. So that's interesting, right? Okay, let's keep going. Saturday, February 28th, 2015, Mission Day 141. Teaching Brother Kungar is very fun, since you ask him one question and he'll go off testifying about and teaching himself and everyone for 5 minutes. So, when Jimenez, their Methodist roommate, joined in and had just as much fun, Sister Johnson and I could not contain the laughter of joy. We had an awesome lesson for Jimenez to come to for the first time. We started with the 10 Commandments in the Bible, then expounded on church, pray, and read in 3 Nephi 18, and then the law of chastity. Jimenez saw how the Book of Mormon supports the Bible, and now he loves it too. I've been praying for opportunities to understand and develop in myself the character of Christ. We taught Albert Parrish part of the message from that talk, and I was thinking about how cool it will be when he really understands from experience the power of Christ's atonement. I've felt it, definitely, but I know I have room to grow in experience and testimony and conversion. I know the what, why, and how of the principle pretty well. I am patiently applying His grace to my life. Yet I'm not worried because I know that His grace is sufficient. that God's plan is perfect, and that as I focus and do my best to align my will with God's, I will become who He knows I can be. And tomorrow is Fast Sunday. Hooray! Perfect opportunity for growth. Also, Happy Leap Day. Oh yeah, it's February 28th. Oh, isn't that supposed to be the 29th? Isn't that the 29th? I feel like it's the 29th. Okay, well, let's talk about it. Okay, so, with Brother Congar, I guess this was the lesson where we were supposed to teach the law of chastity, which was always an uncomfortable time, no matter who we were talking to. It's kind of a difficult subject to talk about at any point in life for a lot of people, but especially if you're, I can't think of a better word than like prudish, but I'm not trying to be like shaming. It was just, missionaries were really young. We probably hadn't even had like a full like appropriate sex education, at least most missionaries, it's like not really comfortable a lot of young people, especially young super religious Mormon people, are not going to be super comfortable talking about like sexuality. And then of course we were supposed to be teaching it to people who like may not be familiar, so like we kind of had to say stuff. So yeah, that was always uncomfortable. I did not enjoy that, but it was fun to have Jimenez there. So at least it wasn't as bad as it could have been, and I think fortunately Jimenez like hasn't gotten involved with the church at all, so I don't feel super bad exposing him to the Book of Mormon and all its problematic, racist, etc. things. It was interesting. Okay, Albert Parrish. I was just talking about the less active member with a ponytail. That's Albert Parrish. And we were teaching him about the character of Christ. And I had mentioned that I had been reading Brad Wilcox's His Grace is Sufficient talk. And that's kind of coming through here because I'm talking and speaking the way that Brad talks in that talk, like His grace is sufficient, God's plan is perfect, and that's, I'm regurgitating that. And in a way it feels a little bit more positive than the way I've been writing about myself lately, because I'm not just like, I'm totally not good enough, I need to be better in every single way. It feels like there's a little bit more of a positive spin, but overall, it's still, I don't think is healthy, because I've still got this idea that the way that I was at that point in time was not good enough, like, one of the affirmations that I like to use pretty regularly is that I am good enough now as I am, right? And I will be good enough over time, even as I like grow in some ways and struggle in some other ways, right? But on my mission, when I was just so trying to be what God wanted me to be, that focus on I'm not enough now because I need to become, it feels like that's really the problem here. And no matter how much I try to put a positive spin on it, overall the idea is I don't think of myself as being enough, and I'm like always thinking I need to improve and be better, and I don't love that. Yeah. Okay. Fast Sunday, March 1st, 2015. Mission Day 142. I had a really cool day today. I decided to go off of the example of true preach my gospel missionaries and fast for the Spirit. That it would be poured out upon Scranton, preparing hearts, that I could be receptive and a more effective tool, Alma 17. All morning, whenever I thought about our upcoming lesson with the new family we were to teach today, I'd get super nervous. It didn't seem like they were going to accept our message at all. I almost ended up having us skip over the restoration to faith in Jesus Christ, the second lesson, just because it would be less confrontational. After our post-church musical rehearsal with Sister Kirsten, we drove over to their home, knocked, and no one was home. I admit to being very relieved, even though I knew I should feel otherwise. But lo and behold, as we turned back down their driveway, they pulled in from church, and they still would let us come do FHE. So we walked in. Sister Johnson and I plopped down on the family room floor. We had a prayer, and then we began to teach the restoration. It wasn't too scary in the beginning, since we had common ground on God and prophets. And then came the great apostasy, and boy was I tempted to shut my mouth and make Sister Johnson do the teaching. But on we went, both bracing ourselves to be kicked out or yelled at or who knows what. And then we began to teach our bold new message about Joseph Smith, and Sister Johnson set me up to share the first vision. That was what I had feared. As I shared, quote, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, unquote. They grew still as the Spirit filled the room. I've never felt confident sharing Joseph's experience. I always feel so scared and unsure and pushy, but today I was filled with the Spirit, and I knew, as my voice began to shake with emotion, that they knew, that I knew, that what I shared is true. There was a moment of quiet as the Spirit worked in our hearts. Tyler and Teresa, the parents, both disagreed with points of doctrine. But their son Trevor was thinking, and Jenny said she wants to go to our church. She wants us to come again. I know that accepting the message is now in each member of that family's hands, but I'm at peace with the role I played. When we teach with the Spirit, they have the opportunity to feel the truth themselves. I'm so grateful for the opportunity we have to fast monthly. We don't always see immediate results when we fast, but today I did. Wow. Yeah, I do remember this. I remember being so nervous, and I remember how amazing and incredible it felt when I was reciting the first vision that I memorized and would share word for word. We sat on the floor. I didn't explain why we sat on the floor, because we liked to use this object lesson of, like, we had a Jenga, the wooden blocks that you make a tower and crash it over. So we would use that as part of the object lesson for the restoration. We would write on every block something about Christ's original church that had prophets and the priesthood and everything. And then as part of the lesson, we would show how when you take things out, and then you take out the priesthood, it knocks over the tower and God's church is gone. And then we would show how some people would get some of the things and build their own little towers, but it wasn't the full tower. And then we would show Joseph Smith got the priesthood restored, and we had the priesthood foundation thing, and then we would build the whole thing again up, That was the thing. So that's why we were on the floor, and it was very, dramatic and nice to have an object lesson, not just be sitting talking, right? Interesting, I have this whole thing framed as here's an example of what real Preach My Gospel missionaries do. They fast for the Spirit. And I if I remember correctly, that there was part of the like training video that new missionaries watched was different, like a set. There was like a set of elders and a set of sisters. I think it's called the district. And they would show how they did different things like very properly. And one of the things that I think the sisters did in the training video was they had this like very very specifically worded prayer of like, we want the Spirit to be poured out upon, like very performative, honestly. So anyway, I was like, oh, I should do that too. And then look what happened. Like, oh yeah, prayer works, fasting works, woohoo. That's how this whole thing was framed. So that's interesting to like see again. And I tacked it at the end, at the beginning of the end, and I finished with like, we don't always see immediate results when we fast, but today I did, So that was a really good sort of faith promoting story there. My little lo and behold that I wrote in made me laugh. And I think I honestly talked like that too when I was a missionary. I like would frequently speak scripture, King James Bible speak. So that's kind of silly and funny to look back on now. The biggest point from this that I have is how a big part of like group indoctrination is doing things that are socially uncomfortable and pushing through, and like that the experience of doing something that feels socially like beyond the boundaries, but then sticking to it and doing it for the group anyway, that like always results in stronger feelings for the group. There's actually instances of like, so, really extreme instances. So I will say this is an extreme example, but just this is one that comes to mind, and it showcases this point very clearly. So there's like there was this group of like some sort of cult that believed that aliens were going to come and destroy the world. And there was a specific day set for when it was going to happen, and the people like who were involved, they like, sold their houses, like quit their jobs, kind of got everything in order for everything to burn, and then like made a public spectacle of themselves, and then nothing happened, and then they had to sort of recover from that. And the interesting thing is, you would think that when something like that happened, it would be like really humiliating, and like the social awfulness of that experience would get people to leave the group. And I think that there are some who are like, ooh, this is too bad, and they like, okay, yeah, that was too embarrassing and terrible. But it turns out that actually those kind of things where there's like a failed prophecy, or people going out knocking doors and getting rejected, this experience actually ties you more to the group or organization. Your commitment becomes stronger because it's like the emotional stakes of accepting that you're wrong and that was a mistake is too devastating. And so you just have to figure out some sort of convoluted reason for why it didn't happen this time, but it's going to happen next time. And you just get even more doubled down. And that's what I see happening here. I was so worried about sharing the story about Joseph Smith and the church. I knew that this family was already religious, and it was going to be like me telling them that they were wrong. And that was really uncomfortable for me. I I wrote that I never felt confident talking about Joseph Smith. I always felt really scared and unsure and pushy. So there was like that tipping point of I was doing something that felt really, it felt like I was taking a risk and I was breaking social rules. And then I did it anyway, and the emotional like response of that bravery was I just like, they listened to me and I felt like really courageous and brave. And we know that the way that I understood what was true and what was not was based off of purely my emotional experience. And that, you know, I felt super, like, I felt super good. Like, having pushed through that and said it anyway. I felt so brave. I felt like God loved me. And then in the end, like, they didn't even really, like, the kids were kind of like, oh yeah, like, I like it. But I could tell the parents didn't really believe. And in a way that, like, made it more of a positive experience for me, and it made me feel more committed. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Like, I wrote this line: when we teach with the Spirit, they, the people we're teaching, have the opportunity to feel the truth themselves. You know? I was like starting to, I think this was one of the first points where I like hit that point of like being able to at least emotionally manipulate myself into the big feelings. And I was probably also starting to figure out how to craft the experience and the narrative for the people in the room, that we all kind of had this emotional upswell experience, right? And that was how I knew what was true, which feels very wild to me now, but yeah, that's, I do remember it. And that's my 22nd week as a Mormon sister missionary. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast if you want to continue following my story. Ratings and reviews are very helpful, and please share this with anyone you think would be interested. I hope you have a great week, and if you want my advice, just remember that you can love others best when you love yourself first. Bye!